Today is May 7th, 1998. We are at the 19th Annual Scientific Sessions of NASPE in San Diego. And this is Dr. Victor Parsonnet speaking with Dr. Paul Gillette about his accomplishments in cardiac pacing, cardiac electrophysiology, and implantable defibrillators. Paul, tell us about yourself. Particularly, let's start with your education. Where did you go to school, and where were you, and how you got into the business of pacing?
Well, I guess it started while I was in high school and college. My father, whose father had been a physician, thought I should be a physician. And I guess as most young men, I didn't know what I really wanted to do, but I just did what my father said. So I went to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill for college and the Medical College of South Carolina. And while I was in South Carolina, I got interested in cardiology and then also in pediatrics. So I went to Texas Children's Hospital for internship, residency, and fellowship.
When was that?
That was in 1969. And when I went to meet Dr. Dan McNamara, who was chief of pediatric cardiology there, and asked him what I should do to get ready for the fellowship, because I'd already decided I'd like to do a fellowship there. And he said, read Circulation. So in that year, the first article in the first issue of Circulation was D'Amato and Lau and Sherlag recording His bundle potentials. And so that kind of caught my interest. And just about every month, there'd be 1 or 2 or 3 articles about, at that point, just recording the His bundle potential. We also had a lot of kids that were getting sick with arrhythmias. In those years, pediatric cardiologists were not very good on arrhythmias. I mean, we knew about PAT, we called it, but not much else. So it's just kind of a nice blend to have the new technology come along, which wasn't really very hard to do, and just bring it from adults to children. And so that's how I got started getting interested in arrhythmias and electrophysiology.
So what did you do after that? You got started, and where did you go?
Well, first we just kind of tried to find normals in children. Turned out the normals in children were about the same as adults. There weren't any really major differences. And then we started to address the children that had had mustard operations for transposition. They were the sickest ones, and we began to realize, with a lot of help from a guy named Galal El-Said, who's now in Egypt, that the arrhythmias were due to sick sinus syndrome, and the surgeons were bumping the sinus node or suturing the sinus node during the surgery. So that led into pacing. We do electrophysiology studies that time, determine the sinus node recovery time, and then we put in a lot of atrial pacemakers, and it really seemed to help. Then a little later, got interested in WPW, and I spent a week with Ken Rosen up in Chicago. Dr. McNamara, my boss in Houston, was real good about letting me go off for a while and learn something. And so he and his group taught me a lot about WPW, and then eventually brought a patient from Chicago to Houston to have not the first WPW operation, but pretty early because he was Jehovah's Witness. And the Chicago surgeons wouldn't do a Jehovah's Witness, but Dr. Cooley, who was our surgeon, was known for that. So that really got me into the WPW thing, and we went on from there. Did a lot of surgery and babies for WPW in Houston and also in Charleston.
So how did you progress from that point? What have you do in your career following those experiences in Houston with those famous people?
Well, I went to Charleston in 1984, and I was to be director of pediatric cardiology. And I just didn't know if I'd be able to keep the arrhythmia referrals coming to Charleston the way we had to Houston, because Houston, as you say, had been kind of a famous place. But as it worked out very well, and I met a surgeon there who was already in Charleston who had trained in WPW surgery. So we carried on and really increased the WPW surgery in Charleston until catheter ablation came along in the early 90s, and then we started in with the catheter ablation.
Are you doing it?
Yes, I do it myself.
Uh-huh.
Do about 100 a year. And the pacemaker, we've just kind of gone along with what the market will allow us to do on the pacemakers. And of course, pacemakers have gotten better and better. I'm a pacemaker recipient myself also, so I have kind of a dual look at that. But one I have has 2 different sensors to increase my rate response, because my sinus node is part of my problem. And all kinds of diagnostics and mode switching, and nice and small, and supposed to last 8 years. And so I've kind of got both sides of the pacemaker thing.
Well, we ought to get back to that in a second. So your career right now, what are you doing now?
So I'm the medical director of pediatric cardiology now in Fort Worth at an institution called Cook Children's Hospital. And we have an 8-person cardiology group and 2 cardiac surgeons that only deal with children and young adults. 2 of us do electrophysiology and pacing. And we've continued our referral patterns from all over the place, so we stay quite busy there too.
One of the reasons we're talking to you, Paul, is you've been very instrumental in work with NASPE. Tell me how you got involved with NASPE and just in general what you've been doing, what you have done with the organization.
Well, you know, I was thinking about that, and I remember at a NASPE meeting in New Orleans when it was still met with the American College of Cardiology, and NASPE would be, I guess it was the Saturday before, if I remember correctly. I think it was you and Cy Furman kind of took me out of one of the little rooms where we were having the scientific conferences and said that I want to get a little more involved in committee work and everything, and so that got me started. And then I don't remember how many years later, but then we started having separate NASPE meetings. I remember the first one in New York. And then when we had the first true NASPE meeting in New Orleans, I was the program chairman for that one. And then the following year in Boston, I was the president. And I've been on a lot of the committees, probably too many to remember. But so I've had a real good time working with everybody in NASPE and see it almost from its birth, really, grow into the organization it is today.
Yeah, what year were you president?
1987.
That was 8 years later. And you still work with us, I know, yeah. which is marvelous. But tell me go back to that pacing experience you had. You told me something before about how you actually saw yourself in the mirror when you were having your first syncopal attack, and it might be interesting to people to hear that, because that's some famous historians talked about how angina looked. Now we know how heart block looks. Or
yeah, it was exciting. I had taken a shower, not particularly a hot shower or anything like that, normal routine, and I was shaving, looking in the mirror at myself, and I could just see myself going down. And I tried to grab onto the sink, and I couldn't, and I kind of fell back and hit my head just a little bit on the wall. But I don't think I was down very long. My wife had already gone to work, and so I got up, then I crawled into the bedroom. I didn't know if it was smart to stand up or not. Called, and she came and got me, took me down to see the cardiologist. And eventually did an electrophysiology study on me, which was not very painful or scary, except I didn't like the idea that he was going to do triples in the ventricle, because I knew I might fibrillate, and I asked Wade McBride, who's the electrophysiologist that worked on me, I said, well, how long do you wait after somebody fibrillates before you shock them? He said, well, you know, studies show that it's best to shock as quick as you can. So I was a little concerned if I fibrillated on the triples that I'd get shocked and feel it,
But you didn't?
I didn't, no, couldn't do that. The only thing I had was sinus node dysfunction, 5-second pauses. So they put a dual chamber pacemaker in with dual rate response crystals.
And how did that operation go? Were you had to use conscious sedation? So you?
Yeah, I was awake. For the EP study, I had 5 milligrams of Valium is all. And for the pacemaker, they gave me some fentanyl in addition to the Valium.
Yeah.
But it really wasn't bad.
So you would recommend it for everybody, right?
If they need it, yeah.
If they need it. Tell us about your personal life. What are you doing, and what's your family like?
Well, I'm married to Vicki Ziegler, who's also a member of NASPE, and she's a pacemaker and electrophysiology nurse. We live up north of Fort Worth on a lake. And we used to live in Charleston, South Carolina. We had a nice sailboat in Charleston, but the lake is not quite big enough to put the sailboat in, so we're in between boats right now. But we're just living there in Fort Worth and traveling around to see our relatives and hoping to do a little sailing out here maybe Saturday afternoon.
You have a bareboat here, or some?
There's a bareboat, the 30-foot Catalina they'll rent out there.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you for this exposure to yourself. It's nice to see you so well. You certainly look well, and I very much appreciate your giving us your time.
Okay, thank you.